Welcome back to the Core Online Learning channel, where we will be having a look at some of your poems. So we'll kick off with My Last Duchess. I know it's one that a lot of people dread because it's quite long, but it is actually a really easy one to understand and grasp the concept of. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lead you through several quotations. Now, again, it's a very long poem. You do not have to remember the entire poem, but it is good to remember a few quotations that you can zoom in on. A lot of the quotations and questions around the poem are actually normally linking to power. So the types of questions that you will see, how is power presented in My Last Duchess? Normally it's something to do with that. Now, My Last Duchess is quite easy to talk about when it comes to the title. So just even remembering the title, we know that we are talking about a duke. A duke is a person who is a member of the royal family or nobility. And when he says my last duchess, we've also got that possessive pronoun my. So when he uses this possessive pronoun, it shows that he thinks he has ownership over his duchess. So that could be our first point. Just from the title, we could zoom in on that title and we've got a point already. We've got some subject terminology in there for our examiner when we say personal pronoun, and we've got some context in there as well when we're talking about the duke having power. People like the duke, monarchs and the royal family in general have a lot of power because of their status, and that's what the duke really focuses on most of the way through. He focuses on his status. So my first quotation, and the quotation that I see as incredibly important, is "That's my last duchess painted on the wall." Now, the painting is symbolic. The painting itself is very, very symbolic. So please always zoom in on that. You don't even need to remember the quotation for this. You just need to remember that he has a painting of his wife. Now, this is important because he is literally objectifying her. And by that, what I mean is he is turning her into an object. Now, at the time, obviously, he was a man and she was a woman, which meant that he had complete ownership over her. So during the time that the poem was set, not the time the poem was written, because remember this was set a few hundred years before it was written, men had complete control over women, in that a woman was the property of her father until she was passed over to her husband, and then she became his property. Now, that wasn't enough for the duke, because the duke felt like he couldn't control his wife enough. He felt that she was too friendly with other people. He felt that he didn't give she didn't give him enough attention, and therefore he didn't feel like she was his object completely. He felt like she was almost too independent. So when he turns her into a painting, that's his desire to get complete control over her coming out. Because when he turns her into a painting, he literally turns her into an object that he can control completely. So that's why that painting is so significant, because it's an object that makes him feel like he has power. So that's a point that we could link to for Ozymandias as well, because he has that statue, and the statue makes him feel like he has power. So he builds this big statue to himself to feel superior to other people, in the same way that the Duke creates this image of his wife so that he can feel he has control over some part of her. So the painting becomes a sort of metaphor for that need for control. So the painting itself is symbolic of that need for control. So you can use metaphor or you could use the word symbolic. It's fine. Then we move on to this quote, which I love because it really does support this idea that he has such a need to control his wife and to turn her into an object that he can have complete control over. So he says, "Since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I." He wants to be the only person who can control who looks at his wife. And by that extension, almost who his wife can look at as well, because remember, she only sort of lives on in this painting. And he thought that her looks went everywhere. He does say that in the poem. So by making sure that he decides where her looks now go, he's deciding that he has complete control over her. And this moment really symbolizes that need for him to control her completely. It ends up becoming quite ironic though, because clearly he's not as powerful as he thinks he is if he has to get rid of her in order to have control over her. So he is not the type of man who can control his wife. He has no real control over her, which is why he has to kill her and then take that control back over her. So it becomes ironic because we just kind of question whether he actually does have any power at all, or whether he is actually quite weak. Remember, at the time, it was a patriarchal society, and patriarchal means dominated by men. So he should be completely dominant over his wife, but he has to get rid of her in order to actually have any power over her. And that's what's really important here. That's where we say this becomes sort of ironic, and it makes him seem like he's actually quite a powerless person. He's actually quite weak. Again, another nice point that we could compare to Ozymandias, because in Ozymandias, he builds this statue to make himself look amazing and wonderful and superior to people. But then ultimately the statue just breaks down and he doesn't look superior anymore. He looks forgotten. So it's really good to look at these two poems in terms of objects. Because I think that's a really good way to sort of look at them as extended metaphors for power. You know, power isn't forever. Power does break down. That leads us on to, she had a heart, how shall I say, too soon made glad, too easily impressed. So he isn't impressed with the way that she is impressed. He doesn't like the fact that she is constantly friendly to other people, actually. So he doesn't necessarily exactly say that she has had an affair, but he hints at this idea that she gives too much attention to other people. And that's why he ends up doing what he does. Now, again, this is where we start to question whether he has any real power. He doesn't seem to have any control over her. And that's when we start to see the Duchess quite weak, even though he seems to be making this dramatic monologue, which, by the way, is when one person is speaking throughout an entire poem. He seems to be having this dramatic monologue, talking to this servant of the next wife, and he sort of seems to be giving her a warning to behave herself. But the entire way through, this warning feels like he doesn't want to have to do it again. He wants complete power. Then we've got this quotation, which is as if she ranked my gift of a 900 years old name with anybody's gift. Now, this gift is not a physical gift. This is a gift of status. So when he calls it a gift, he is really trying to say that he has brought up this girl's status. So when she married him, she enjoyed the perks of privilege, and he calls attention to the fact that his name is 900 years old, because he wants to make sure that it is very clear that he has this status and he is asserting his power over her, because he wants everyone to know. He wanted his last wife to know, and he wants his new wife, because remember, he's speaking to the servant of his new wife, the daughter of the count. He wants his new wife to know that he has this 900 years old name, because he wants them to respect his status. And he then says she ranks that with anybody's gift. So it shows that she didn't have that sort of love of status like he does, and that's why he got quite angry at her. Then we've got, even then would be some stooping, and I choose never to stoop. So he talks about maybe explaining himself to his wife and maybe explaining how she should act. But then he says, I choose never to stoop. Now, when you stoop to someone's level, it means you bring yourself lower. And again, it seems so important to him to be superior and to have her feel inferior that he doesn't even seem to explain this to her. He doesn't seem to want to continue to tell her how he wants her to behave. He wanted her to just know. He wanted to be able to tell her once how she should behave, and he wanted her to continue that way. So it's really interesting that he brings this idea of stooping to someone's level. It really shows how much he looked down on his wife and how he didn't see her as significant enough for him. So he really does see himself as very superior. Now, I have said a few times that obviously he's talking to the servant of the Count, and the Count has a daughter, and the daughter is the Duke's next wife, or he's trying to make the daughter his next wife. And he actually says, though his fair daughter's self, as I avowed at starting, is my object. So again, this idea of object comes through. He talks about his next wife as if she's an object too. So it shows that desperation to own them, to make sure that they are his, which it wasn't unusual for the time, but it does show that he needs power over the wife that he chooses. And then the last quotation that I would look at as well. And remember, you don't need to know all of these quotations, but a lot of them are quite interesting quotations to analyse. Now, he seems to surround himself with objects that make him feel powerful. And that symbolises his need for power. So the objects almost become metaphors for his feelings and his feelings of inadequacy. So when I say he feels inadequate, I mean he doesn't feel good enough, and he wants to feel better. He wants to bolster his ego. He's quite an arrogant character. So when he says, notice Neptune, though taming a seahorse, thought a rarity, which Claus of Innsbruck cast in bronze for me. He mentions the artist's name, and he's done that quite a few times. He does name drop Frau Pandolf, Claus of Innsbruck. He name drops these artists to show off that wealth and to show off that status and the artists that he has access to. But what's really interesting is he commissions these pieces of art that make him feel particularly powerful. Now, one of those is a portrait of his wife, and the other one is a sculpture of a god, the god of the sea. That's Neptune. And Neptune is the god of everything in the sea, and he's taming a seahorse. So this is a lower creature, this is a lower being. And this idea of taming something that's lower than you doesn't really make you powerful, but to the Duke, that's what it does. So even though he should have easy control over a woman because of the time frame that this is written in, he doesn't have that control. And it seems very much like he just wants to control everything inferior to him. And so when he talks about Neptune taming a seahorse, he's talking actually about wanting complete control over everything, even things that are inferior. So when you see this, make sure that you explain that this is a metaphor for his need for control. Don't just say he has this sculpture and this shows. Always say that it's a metaphor for his need for control, because he loves surrounding himself with objects that remind him of control, that remind him of power. The portrait of his wife reminds him of his power. The sculpture of Neptune reminds him of taming something below him. So he's quite a character, a very egotistical character for sure, the entire way through this dramatic monologue, where he's the only one speaking. So remember that as well. He doesn't allow the other person to speak because, again, for him, it's all about status, it's all about power, and it's all about him. He makes everything about him. So that's what's very interesting about this poem. So hopefully that was useful. It is a much longer poem. I will go through some key points from each poem in the power and conflict cluster for you. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe so that we can keep putting out very, very interesting videos for you.